We've got a great lineup of speakers. We're going to start with Verena from the World Bank, who's already posed a question and made a comment a bit earlier on. We've also got Stephen Pearce, who's here as the Director of the Programme Staff Bureau in USAID. So we've got two representatives from donor agencies. We've also got Marcus Cox, who, as well as being a Gullus, is one of the lead reviewers for ICAI. And we've got Lenny Wild, from Senior Research Fellow from ODI. I feel like, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Faulty Towers. There's a brilliant Faulty Towers exercise where John Cleese has managed to upset all the guests in his hotel, and the guests have got a whole range of questions, and all these questions come back at him, and John Cleese says, "They are brilliant questions. All of you deserve a full and comprehensive answer to your questions. My wife will give it to you," and then he proceeds to run out of the hotel. So I'm hoping that there's a lot of questions that have been flagged in the previous sessions, and what we're going to try and grapple with for the next hour or so is how can external actors, whether they're technical assistants, but primarily donor agencies, how can we address, particularly I think the issue that Kate raised about, lots of us know all of this, so why haven't we done it better? So that's the challenge for us. Again, we'll try and stick to time as best as we can, and we're going to start off with Verena, and then we'll go to Marcus, and then Steve, and then Lenny to finish off with. So hopefully the technology will work, and we'll switch straight away to Washington. Verena.
I thank you very much, Simon. I think you can all see the presentation. Let me start to click through. Can you hear me okay? Okay, perfect. So my name is Verena Fritz. I'm a senior public sector specialist with the World Bank, and I have been working on our South Sudan engagement for the past two and a half years. And I'm also just taking on an engagement on Burundi along similar lines to strengthen PFM and other government capacities and functions. And so speaking a little bit based on that experience, and there's already been a lot of discussion on South Sudan that this will also connect to. So let me start off with some crucial priors. And I've done a lot of work also, on general political economy analysis and trying to think through what are feasible reforms and reform approaches. And I think one conviction that I've come to is that truly it's a bit of a thing that we often say, but we don't fully absorb what it means. External actors cannot make reforms happen. Only domestic actors can. So things will only really happen if they're consistent with incentives and pressures in the country and to the stakeholders specifically who take decisions. What external actors can do is they can reinforce existing reform commitment through the money that they put behind, through the advice that they provide, etc. So we can influence things at the margin and in potentially important ways, but we cannot sort of change something that is green into red. That doesn't work, or that's red into green. Now, when we talk about difficult environments, there's two or three key ideas that I think are valuable. One is that we can look at incremental changes and specific opportunities, and we can look at the issue of whether there are islands of excellence, potential or already emerging islands of excellence that can be reinforced. There can perhaps be some bigger gains during windows of opportunity. And we've recently looked at a very interesting study, at a very interesting case of a sort of a major turnaround. So those things can happen also. And then in difficult environments, the challenge is also how to deal with distortions. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on. Given these priors, one issue is that there's often a lack of clear and realistic expectations. So the donor principles, if you want, be it the World Bank's management and our board or management in other development organizations, may often acknowledge that the situation in a country is difficult, but they may still want some form of big progress. It doesn't fully translate into an adaptation of expectations. That's something that I think still is a challenge all through aid efforts. Then coming to the next issue, I want to just emphasize that the task of coordinating support to public sector and PFM reforms is really faces some added difficulties in conflict-affected environments. And we've already spoken a little bit about this in the previous session. So one is that staff turnover is high due to the shorter tours of duty. And most people don't necessarily, it will be perhaps harder to recruit staff if we lengthen the tours of duty. But it is an issue because then you face almost annual turnover in many organizations. And it really loses institutional memory of what has been discussed before. Also, we face the issue that less staff is actually located in country. It's expensive for us. People don't want to do it. It's not a family post, etc. And then on top of that, governments tend to be not coherent and struggle to lead in the coordination of development support. So we say coordination works best when it's government-led, but that's hard to do when government itself is a lot in a crisis mode. And another issue that we have really faced very concretely in South Sudan is that development partners are more likely to suddenly pull out or not approve proposed projects. So for donor Y to plan programs in a way that complements what donor X is doing becomes a constant struggle. So if we say, okay, donor Y is taking care of this area, so we should support that area, or donor Y will have delivered progress in this area, so we can build on that in this other area, becomes a real struggle if suddenly the other donor changes their plans or pulls out or lives with extended periods of uncertainty. And that's something that we'll be facing again now that South Sudan has made a peace agreement. This unpredictable donor behavior of when projects are approved and whether they will be closed down gives an incentive to government to pursue different funding sources for the same areas of support that they need. So it reinforces the non-coordination that government does because it needs to constantly struggle to make sure it does get funding for the most critical areas. Now, we know that the OECD and others have told us to avoid stop-go support for state building, but this is very, very difficult to do in practice, and there's big pressures to go otherwise. And again, we can go a little bit more deeply into what that has meant in South Sudan. Now, Abraham has already spoken a bit about, and others, about the big picture. So we had the initial emergence of a post-conflict government during a period of steeply rising oil prices and associated with that, steeply increasing government revenue. So there was a limited need for financial support from development partners. And at the same time, there was also limited absorption capacity, but there was still huge needs to develop infrastructure and services in a country where that hadn't been established over decades, or only very marginally so. In South Sudan, the security sector remained very dominant in government decision-making, but also allocations and staff numbers, and I'll show a brief illustration of that. Good PFM is seen as important, of course, by development partners and has enjoyed considerable support. But because it was financially self-reliant, government didn't have a strong incentive to really let development partners into the kitchen of this. So there were discussions, can we do a GMAP type model as in Liberia? And that was never, those didn't even get close in terms of the discussions. So significant technical assistance was put in place and a system, an IFMIS system, has been installed. And what we have observed is there have been some quite good effects on budget planning, but less so really on how budgets get executed. And overall, the fiduciary environment has remained weak in a situation that has become much more difficult recently. At the same time, there have been on both sides, so between the government and the development partners, there have been major frustrations with slow disbursements over a number of years. So it's also a case that illustrates how much time it takes for governments and for development partners to come into an understanding of how things should work, of organizing procurement packages, etc. And it's really something that's very frustrating. It's also rooted in the fact of it's challenging to bring enough staff into these positions, etc. There have been huge training needs. So capacity, of course, tends to be a constraint in low-income, difficult environments. But there's also been big frustration with training efforts made, and the problem that this issue, do we make progress, do we make gains, has remained quite anecdotal. So problems with the selection of who is being trained, getting to a more sustainable approach, so getting away from more ad hoc type of interventions. And we're trying to do that in how we are approaching this now going forward. And it's been very challenging to match training being offered and prior knowledge. So apart from everything else, South Sudan did a switch in the language from Arabic to English. And so anybody who had prior training might not have the English language skills, IT knowledge initially very limited. So the ability to tailor what is being done on training to the starting point of knowledge is challenging, and also again to make that consistent with expectations of what development partners want to fund. Still, as has been discussed in the previous section, there have been some sticks in terms of gradual gains and some interesting changes that have continued despite this renewed conflict for a substantial period of time, especially with regards to strengthening fiscal transfers to subnational governments. And it's really quite interesting how that has matched between how that has been an opportunity where there was an interest from central government to show that it can deliver something, to shore up support at subnational levels, and that has also fitted with a technical effort to try and strengthen those transfers. So let me just show here a little bit the development of government revenue in red, and then the blue line is the official development assistance. So you can see here from 2005 to 2011, there's a huge acceleration in government revenue, and aid is a relatively limited contribution. Then that switches during the oil shutdown in 2012, and then it's switching also now again with the decline in the oil price and the reduced production. Now the aid, just to mention that the aid value for 2014, that's only humanitarian assistance. So a lot of the assistance has been pulled from being development focused to being humanitarian over the past 2 years. As I've mentioned, there's also a continued huge dominance of the security sector, which is different from some other difficult environments that we've looked at, for example, Liberia or Sierra Leone, where the security sector really was pulled back once the conflict ended. In South Sudan, the green is the armed forces, and then the red is the organized forces, so the wildlife services, the police, the fire service. And the blue is the civil service, so that's all your teachers and health workers, etc., and sort of central government. So that's quite small relative to the rest of the payroll. Now, this is just a quick overview of all the different subnational transfers that were put into place in recent years. And it's really quite surprising. I mean, some of it, as has been mentioned in the previous session, hasn't really flown yet, most notably the county development grant. But several of these have been put in place. The formulas have been improved with this effort to try and get more resources down to the subnational level, and also to get it to particular sectors. Because don't forget, even at the subnational level, the subnational governments have to pay for the red portion. So a lot of the subnational revenue goes for this red portion of the police and the wildlife, paid by state and local governments. So the attempt here with these transfers is to protect these transfers to go directly into education and health and water. And so those are good. And government has tried to maintain those transfers and to, in a context where overall resources have been shrinking quite a bit. So that's really quite remarkable. Whether that will succeed is still something to see. But it's remarkable that in such a difficult environment, this has had quite a degree of traction. So it goes back also to Tim's point. You have to find where what development partners try to do and seek to do and what government seeks to do intersects. Now, just to mention a few illustrations on how conflict changes our institution building support. So for the World Bank, the design of a new program or project to support institution building started in early 2013, targeting public administration and PFM strengthening. At that time, there were major other projects under implementation, and there was a plan for a very large-scale South Sudan Partnership Fund, so a new multi-donor trust fund. Then we have the outbreak of conflict in late 2013, And initially, a lot of the projects are just pulled, staff is being evacuated. So suddenly government finds itself without a lot of the technical assistance. Then these slowly return in 2014, despite the ongoing conflict, but it doesn't affect the capital city. But then more and more assistance is shifted from development assistance and technical assistance to being delivered as humanitarian aid, and new projects are being put on hold, including our own. And then we have the withdrawal and closing of existing support. So there is, despite all of this, has been some notable institutional resilience, but really it's struggling, trying to see what can we still shore up, and efforts to sustain some support from more short-term sources that various development partners have had. But really you get into this stop-go. When a conflict re-erupts, then HQs halt assistance for also, if you want, good reasons, and that affects institution building support, and it does get put on hold a lot. These are just, last slide, some options of doing things differently. So now we are facing a new period of post-conflict peace and state building following the late August peace agreement. It would be very important to get to reasonably realistic expectations. So, we have this idea that there will be an inclusive enough pact, and that will allow us to restart development assistance. We know from experience in other post-conflict environments that there is often not a linearity of progress, and the security dilemmas will remain very important, as will be various, other challenges. Now on public financial management, we suddenly find ourselves in a very different context with a deep fiscal crisis, which may be an opportunity, but is also really an extent of a crisis that may be too much to digest. I think we need more comprehensive as well as more flexible support. So ideally more from a pooled resource rather than these different pieces allocated by different funders. So that you can really achieve comprehensiveness and reduce a bit the ongoing costs of coordination. And we need to really connect better also to PFM strengthening at subnational levels where more and more money is being moved. It's urgent to get some greater clarity of what may work with regards to capacity strengthening. And that doesn't mean that we don't know what could work, but we need an actual explicit monitoring of where are we making progress and where not, rather than trading anecdotes where some donors say, well, nothing has been achieved over 10 years, and others say, well, but we think something has taken off in Ministry of Finance, but nobody can show this either way. Seeking to find a more sustainable approach that includes these local institutions for training, so trying to invest and making something that is sustained within the country, even if it continues to rely on outside funding, and getting this issue of coordination and information sharing on a stronger footing. There are some efforts that seem to point in the right direction, but a lot of the decisions are yet to come. So let me stop here. In terms of the wider picture between the state building effort and the delivery, which currently is being supported through humanitarian aid, it is really a cycle that ideally you have a mutual support, but it can, for individual decisions on development partners, it can be hard or challenging to make those trade-offs, as has also been quite widely discussed. Let me stop here.
Very much. I'm going to just move swiftly on to Marcus.
Sure. All right. Thanks, Simon. I think today it's been hugely encouraging to hear that opportunities for positive change occur even in the most difficult environments. But it's obviously far from straightforward for donor agencies to take advantage of those opportunities. Obviously, money and technical knowledge are a necessary part of that equation. But donors also need to be making astute decisions about what's the right sort of reform horse to back, and then how to ride that horse, I guess, successfully through a very complex terrain of different sort of local interests and actors. so that they're finding solutions which are not just good on paper, but which are actually viable in the context in which they're working. And all of this calls for a much more sophisticated form of engagement from donors than we've traditionally seen. So my topic is sort of what it might take to deliver that more sophisticated form of engagement. And in this, I'm drawing on my experience from having been an evaluator on both the BSI program and the Africa Governance Initiative. So if some of what I'm saying sounds a little bit like what Tim said earlier on, that's not entirely a coincidence. But also our experience across ICAI's review program, where ICAI has put a lot of effort over the course of many reviews over the last couple of years into understanding what are some of the institutional reasons why some patterns of behaviour are constantly being repeated, particularly within the DFID context. So I've got sort of 7 challenges that I'd like to draw your attention to. That's probably 1 minute per challenge, so I'll have to have my skates on. I think the first is that we're still stuck. No matter what learning is there in the literature about delivering reform and institutional change, we're still stuck in old mental models about institutional change. I think we still bring this kind of deficit model to the table, where we start off with an assessment of the deficiencies of the institution we're looking at, and we try and think about how you would have a sort of a systemic approach to addressing those problems. And the weaknesses of this approach are by now very well known. It lends itself to over-ambition, to institutional templating, because as soon as you're in a deficit model, you're always implicitly or explicitly you're comparing it to some sort of international best practice model or something you're familiar with. And of course, that it tends to sort of privilege the technical over the politically informed. But I think that most fundamentally, starting with what an institution is bad at is this sort of very poor foundation for a reform program, because it puts you right squarely into all of the sort of collective action problems that are the underlying reason for the poor performance in the first place. So the alternative is instead to think of institutional change in terms of incremental improvements from an existing set of capacities, focusing on areas where there is an actual or at least a potential coalition of interests in favour of change. And that's where the sort of realism comes from, because if you start with what's there and think about the next steps to improve it, then immediately you're in the business of crafting solutions that can potentially work in the country context. The second thing is around how we think about the design and implementation of aid programs. I think we need to start breaking down this traditional sequence of first design and then implement. Because what's clear from the success stories that we heard about this morning is that success doesn't come from working out all of the answers in advance. It comes from a sort of a sustained engagement that builds knowledge and relationships and puts the program in a response to identify and reform opportunities and respond to them. And one of our sort of consistent findings from across ICAI reviews has been that DFID tends to put all of its very considerable intellectual energy into the design process, while treating, to some extent, the implementation as much more a kind of an administrative process of contract management. And there you sort of lack that kind of sophisticated thinking about how to work your way through a complex reform terrain. And you essentially leave all of your eggs in the basket of the ideas you had at the time of the design. The third challenge is about investing in relationships. That you really need a sustained engagement in order to build trust and become to some degree embedded in the institution that you're trying to support. And this, of course, is what BSI and AGI as well do very well. And there seems to be a kind of an insider-outsider sweet spot that needs to be attained, that gives you genuine insight into the internal dynamics of the institution, that enables you to be useful to them, to come across as a solution to problems that they need to solve. But at the same time, leaves you enough freedom of manoeuvre that you can be an honest broker in a reform process. The fourth thing is about investing in skills. It's clear that the successful examples that we've heard about today involve an exceptional combination of technical skills, of political analysis, of very high-level communication skills, and the ability to run, in a sense, run a program as a campaign over time. And it's clear that that's a kind of a real craft. Craft is a sort of a word we don't use much, but diplomats think of what they do as a craft, that they can learn. And I think to some extent we have to recapture that for the aid business as a craft about helping to support reform processes. Now, I think that that BSI has to some extent been able to bottle that. They've been able to sort of articulate what is the package of skills that they need, and they've been, I think, very successful at recruiting for those package of skills. The problem is that the problem with sort of having a delivery model that depends upon exceptional people is that they don't come along very often, right? And I think if everybody started to sort of articulate that and started to sort of recruit for the same sets of skills, I think we'd have real trouble. So we have to think about how we go about identifying and building those skill sets. The fifth challenge is around risk appetite, because it's clear that working in this way involves a willingness to try out multiple things, knowing that many of them won't pay off, but in the hope that one or two of them will deliver a real major payoff that sort of justifies the wider intervention. And of course that involves that more robust risk appetite, which is much talked about these days, but is still not really sort of in the institutional culture, I think, of most donor organisations. It has to be coupled with an ability to identify failures quickly and learn from them and move on. I mean, trial and error is a perfectly legitimate way of doing development assistance, provided that you actually learn from it. Otherwise, it's just error, right? Here, I think, part of it is being much more explicit about the risks we're taking on in individual programs. I think that, risk appetite gets talked about in a very abstract way, but it's still, the expectation is that every program delivers a set of definable impacts. And I think if we can make it much more explicit when we're in high risk but potential high return mode, we kind of give permission for those, and we sort of align the incentives of those who are involved to be much more frank about risks and about failure. The sixth thing is on contracting models, and this, of course, is a huge issue and underlines a lot of the incentive problems that we've been hearing about today. You need to give those delivering programs the flexibility of engagement in order to work this way. And we do see that sort of starting to emerge. I mean, BSI itself is a very interesting model of a program that's been sort of to some degree liberated from the tyranny of the log frame. But as we do that, of course, log frames have a purpose. And we're in an environment where sort of accountability over aid dollars is incredibly important. And if you liberate them from the tyranny of the log frame, how do you actually go about ensuring the accountability that's necessary for them to operate? And I think there's a huge set of issues that I know DFID is working through at the moment around this. If you're not holding your implementers to account by monitoring their inputs and outputs sort of directly, what exactly are you doing, and how do you recognise sort of good enough performance when it's there? And what we see amongst sort of the talk about adaptable and flexible programming is a number of trends that work in quite the opposite direction, which is particularly around moves towards more output-based or results-based contracting models, which is a complicated topic in itself, but I think has the potential to shift all of the incentives in completely the wrong direction for this kind of operation. And the last challenge is about scaling up this kind of assistance. Because it's all very well for a kind of a niche program like BSI to deliver some impressive successes, but how are you going to deliver that? DFID spent, or the UK spent £12.4 billion on ODA last year, and the government has committed to spending 30% of it in fragile states. The actual proportion is probably already higher than that. So, it's very hard to imagine how you could spend £3 billion sort of flexibly and adaptively brokering solutions to collective action problems. It's a hard thing to do on scale. And I think there's a real question as to what happens in some of these institutions if everybody's doing this. I mean, if the sort of Doing Aid Differently campaign were to make this, achieve a paradigm shift so that everybody was trying to do this, what would you have all of these different institutions sort of jockeying for position, trying to have the sort of the ear of the counterparts in order to be able to work in this way? So it's clear that while a paradigm shift may be needed, we're talking about sort of one element within what will have to continue to be a sort of a complicated ecosystem of different approaches and different ways of delivering development assistance. And I think to some extent what BSI has been able to do is, in some of its context, is to step across the line and become a strategic advisor to a counterpart on how to manage this complicated world of development assistance, how to manage the development partnership itself, and sort of work on the collective action problems that are inherent in the development partnership. And that might be one way of thinking about this, that although we still need this sort of full ecosystem of different types of assistance, to have this ability to use some of these more flexible and adaptive approaches to get at the problem of how to do aid effectively in itself could be one way of cracking this particular nut. But I think I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you very much. That's great. Just while I think, yeah. Right, I'm going to hand over to Stephen, USAID. What are you going to do? Is there a slide?
This is on.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I do have a PowerPoint. I think based on today's discussion and Marcus's presentation, I think I'm going to cut in half the slides the very polished slides that took me a long time to put together because I think that for me at least this has been a very good day. I've learned a lot. I think a lot of the issues have been put very frankly on the table, and I'd sort of like to continue that. And we're not recording this, are we?
We are, yes.
Okay.
We won't listen.
Okay. Well, I do hope you listen. I just hope that some of this doesn't come back and bite me. But I think I'd like to focus more on, given what's already been said, not so much the what and the how, but a little bit more on the who. And let me explain that just a little bit more. I was going to talk a lot about a series of reform efforts that fall broadly under the heading of USAID Forward that we started early on in the past administration. And they're a very important set of reforms. This is kind of a dangerous occasion. Marcus, I'm glad you brought up DFID because I'm not sure many of the other bilateral aid agencies would want the U.S. to speak for all bilateral aid agencies. But I do feel that bilateral aid agencies are a unique set of actors. And our role has been changing over time. Everybody's heard about what a small percentage ODA actually makes up in the total contribution to the development assistance that's going from the developed countries to the developing countries. That statistic has always made me smile a bit because it assumes that all this other private sector money actually is going towards some sort of development outcome. If there's one thing we can say about ODA, it's that it's very intentionally going towards development. It may not achieve everything that it's designed to, but so I do want to talk about the unique role of bilateral aid agencies in this new context, but particularly about who is employed at bilateral aid agencies and what we are doing to focus on our people and giving them the space to change. We've talked about, is there space out there for reform? I guess a question to ask is there space within bilateral aid agencies for internal reform? And I'd like to spend most of my time talking about some of those internal reforms. Just a quick question. How many of you, when you read the program or saw the announcement of this event, thought that we were going to talk about conflict-affected and fragile states? A fair number, right? Maybe slightly more than half. Well, it does say driving change in challenging contexts. And one of the things that I'm responsible for at USAID is both the long-term career development of the program officers, but also the knowledge, skills, and aptitudes that we require for incoming. And as we were looking at some of those knowledge, skills, and aptitudes, context matters. And so we thought, well, let's look at fragile states, and then let's look at everything else, and then let's see how much they differ. And what we found out, or what I came to understand is that those knowledge and skills that we're looking at in fragile states are really just development knowledge and skills. And so it doesn't really make sense to separate the two contexts. Development itself is challenging, so almost everywhere we work that I know of, is challenging. And so I'm not going to differentiate between the two. I just think that this is very much a challenging issue. So just a bit about, where do I point? Oh, there we go. So these reforms came out of the presidential policy on development that was launched. And this was very important in the US for the first time since 1961. We actually had a policy on development. I think that cannot be understated. And they roughly fall into 7 areas. And I think that this first area, talent management, is so critical. Rebuilding policy capacity, strengthening monitoring and evaluation, rebuilding budget management, what we call local solutions, the focus on science and technology, and then, of course, innovation. I like to spend most of the time talking about 3 of these, talent management, local solutions, and then strengthening monitoring and evaluation. While there's 7 reform areas, they basically fall into 3 buckets. One is around results, one is around local solutions and partnerships, and the other one is how we learn in order to scale up. Those are the 3 broad buckets of reform. What we're really trying to do is get permission from our political masters to be more responsive, to be better partners. And what the missions are, come back to Washington all the time with, is we need more flexibility. And as already been mentioned, flexibility is not right up the top of the, our political masters' agenda. So how can you phrase flexibility in a way that makes sense to political decision makers? I think one of the things that's been established today is that the political economy in donor countries is at least as important, if not more so, as the political economy in developing countries. And what we're using as a frame is the concept of sustainability. In other words, this is a way for us to marry the imperative on flexibility with long-term development impact. And of course, some people say, well, this is a way for us to measure how close we are to graduation in any particular country. But really what we're looking for is, how do you sustain hard-won development gains over time? And what we're saying is that flexibility, in other words, the local solution aspect, the need to have locally driven agenda by local leaders achieve local results, is the key to this, to sustainability. I'm going to skip quickly over this and get to, and get to this slide. One of the things that we're now focused on and seized with at the agency is understanding the core competencies that are needed by our staff to adapt and to collaborate and to learn and to apply that to results in a way that's both timely within a business agenda, but also a way that enhances transparency and accountability. So it's beyond budgeting, it's beyond program planning and beyond reporting. Those are certainly technical skills, but there's a whole other series of what some have described as intangibles. There was an earlier comment made in the panel before that these things cannot be learned, cannot be taught. If that were the case, I'd be out of a job. And so for parochial reasons alone, I'm going to maintain that there are indeed things that we can do to strengthen our capacity to do things. USAID staff is approximately around 8,000. Those are direct hires. There's a number of other contract staff. Of that 8,000, 4,000, a little over half, are what we call foreign service nationals. In other words, people who work for USAID from a particular country in that country. The remaining 4,000 are foreign service officers, just over 2,000, 2,300, spread around the world in over 100 countries, in approximately 80 country and regional missions. And then there's just slightly under 2,000 direct hire staff in Washington. So the task is big, and we are focused on technical areas, but increasingly some of the important things that we've discussed today. A renewed emphasis on project design, but within an overall program cycle. Design is a technical skill that can be taught, that can be gauged against certain types of performance measures. But within the program cycle, it's just one additional step. We are promoting something now that we call CLA, Collaboration, Learning, and Adapting. And the project design is now not this blueprint, but something that is understood to change constantly. To do this well, we need to focus on a broad new set of skills that some of our officers have, some don't, but all of them, we're changing the way that we hire, we're changing the way that we train, we're changing the way that we do performance evaluations, the annual performance evaluations. And some of these areas I've outlined for you there, systems thinking, collaboration, monitoring and evaluation that then turns into learning, which then affects decision making, change management, not just external change, the change that we're trying to promote, but also ways in which we have to change internally in order to do that. Risk management, there's been a lot of discussion on the importance of risk and understanding risk and getting the space then to take those risks. And then lastly, I just want to say a word or two about learning. And it's not just learning what works and what doesn't. It's learning about how we can then change what we do and feed that into the program cycle in a way that, in a timely way that actually makes a difference. One of the terms that I heard or read actually was the term of collaborative leadership. Sometimes to hear somebody from the U.S. talk about leadership, you get the wrong impression. But what I think we mean is how do we move forward together in a way that pays respect to both locally defined needs and interests, but also moves the ball forward in our own political economy. There's several other slides and several other points that I'd like to make. I think my 10 minutes is up, and so maybe we can do some of that in the Q&A.
Brilliant. Thank you. Steve, thank you very much. Thank you. So, Lenny, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think my job at the end of this panel is largely just to keep you all awake, so I'm going to try to do that. And I'm going to draw... I work at ODI where I lead a programme looking at politics and governance and have focused a lot on how politics and governance affects the delivery of services. But I've also been part of networks like Doing Development Differently, which have been name-checked throughout today. So I'm going to draw off of my experience sort of on those two levels and offer a few reflections. Can I have the thing? But I'll also try not to cover too much ground of what's already gone before, because Marcus and others have already touched on lots of, I think, the key themes here. But it seems to me, we all have a pretty good idea of what the challenge around development assistance is, and that's been, I think, well emphasised already today. Certainly from our work on services, it's clear that if we take one thing from the MDG experience, it should be that providing money and sort of technical solutions in the face of very complex problems we know is often insufficient. It's led to very uneven progress and can be counterproductive, including in more contested and challenging environments. And if we look at the big development challenges that we face today, whether that's the serious lagging in terms of access to sanitation, in terms of making progress around maternal mortality, in terms of issues like climate change. These require changes in behaviour, perhaps challenging vested interests or the status quo. So we know that this is the challenge, and yet we also know that a lot of development assistance can still tend towards, if you like, underestimating uncertainty, overestimating what we can achieve in a given period of time, recognising that politics and governance are a crucial part of the puzzle, but tending towards big, grand, ambitious projects to redesign institutions, which have had, I think, to coin Kathy's phrase, fairly mixed progress, i.e. we've not done very well in doing that. And that actually, as we've been very much emphasising today, the real sort of transferable lesson around how you can support progress is that as much as you can draw off international experience, as much as you can have a good understanding of what the problems are, it's not until you start to take action that you'll really know if what you think was going to work will. So there has to be a lot of testing and learning and iteration built in. And I think the examples from BSI and others this morning sort of really captured, what change looks like, but also perhaps how wide some of the gulf might be between some of the current practice that we see. And I think, as others have said, these ideas are not new. They've been around probably for as long as development practice has been around. People have been talking about the need to be more adaptive and iterative, in different ways for a very long time. I think we are seeing a bit of a resurgence at the moment. I think that's been helped by the likes of Matt Andrew et al. Talking about ideas like problem-driven iterative adaptation, but also by some of the interest now in systems thinking and complexity, a number of areas which are bubbling up, as well as, I think, a real experience in sectors around how to apply this, whether that's around things like making markets work for the poor, whether that's around experience around health system strengthening, the Ebola response we heard about this morning. That there's I think, an increasingly noisy landscape pushing for reform, but it's still one that the different parts of are not necessarily always talking to each other. I think it's still the case, and unfortunately it's always been the case around these sorts of debates, that different efforts have their own centres of gravity, organisational homes, sectoral focuses. So we find it hard to come up with a sort of shared, if you like, collective voice about what change would look like. And I have been part, as I mentioned, of the Doing Development Differently network, which is about a year in now. And the idea of that network grew from a reflection that some of the different parts of this landscape needs to be talking to each other more, and that actually we agreed on a lot more than we disagreed on, despite the fact that we come at this, as I said, from different starting perspectives, organisations and so on. So we've come up with a set of principles looking across different communities that are working in this space, and I think they're very much in line with the sorts of things that Tim this morning, that Kathy, that Marcos were talking about as well. This was put online as a manifesto, signed up to by people in about 60 different countries, far beyond any of our original sort of networks and links. So again, an interesting sign of the extent to which these ideas can carry and can carry across different communities. But I think, fairly reasonably, we've been hearing already today a sense of cynicism about the fact that we're still talking about a set of principles rather than thinking through, what they look like in practice and how we can really achieve that change. And I think, so it is important for us to reflect on what signs do we have that change is happening. And it seems to me we do need to recognise that a number of agencies are, at the moment, actively grappling with how to operationalise these principles. If we had someone on the panel from the UK's Department for International Development, they would be talking about their better delivery agenda, which grew out of a fairly rigorous internal review process, looking at what was working and what wasn't around internal ways of working, management cultures, and so on. It's led to things like the SMART rules, attempt to get kind of shorter, sharper set of rules to govern what different staff are doing. It has leadership buy-in, and I think is trying to open space for looking at how to be more adaptive and flexible. We've had Steve talking about USAID, various initiatives, and I think a similar emphasis around sustainability, around better programming as the end goal. And we've been hearing today from a bunch of implementers of different shapes and sizes. I think it is often the slightly smaller organisations that are more nimble, more agile, who are really putting these things into practice and are starting to document that and to share it with others. So, it's not that nothing is happening, but I think it is fair to reflect, and this is something that Pablo Yanguas at ESID in Manchester has picked up on, that what we still have is a bunch of what he called lone rangers, committed individuals and groups within sometimes large organisations who get this, who are on board, who are trying to make and open up a bit of space in the remit that they have, but that isn't necessarily yet travelling up to the influence on some of the large organisations working in this space. And it does feel to me that as much as we need, and we've heard calls from this today, we still need more evidence, we still could widen the networks, we still could think about some sharper language. I know some of our work that talks about being politically smart and adaptive doesn't really roll off the tongue in terms of communicating what it is we're interested in. But it seems to me we're only really going to get that breakthrough if we get, if you like, a sort of a bandwagon effect, or some standard bearers who really start to, if you like, champion this approach happening at a larger level. So you've got a number of programs which are, if you like, of sufficiently large scale, which are effective, which are well publicised, which are putting these things into practice. And I guess we watch that space around some of what Kathy's doing in Nigeria to see if there are examples like that which are significantly larger than initiatives that we've seen thus far that start to really deliver results. But it also seems to me that if we're going to get this sort of bandwagon effect, then we also need to think about change that needs to be happening at different levels. I think at the moment we're seeing some focus and innovations around, if you like, changing some of the rules and processes within organisations. I think DFID's Better Delivery Agenda, for example, is speaking to that through the SMART rules and so on. But change needs to filter into management styles, into management cultures, working cultures, office cultures, right, within country offices as well as within head office. And I thought it was interesting, Steve, your reflections on staffing, I think would sit somewhere within that. But I think we shouldn't forget that this also needs to start to penetrate into the public discourse as well. And I think this, to me, links a bit to Andrew's call for us to articulate the theory as well as the tactics. And that, articulating how we think change happens, I think needs to happen in terms of the public debate around development, the debate within countries around the world, as well as in rooms like this. And I think I would say we're doing much less well the further down that list you go. And it seems to me that perhaps what we need to do is to flip around our entry point, perhaps to start with some of the changes around public discourse and the working cultures, rather than fixing on changes in rules or tools or frameworks to help get us there. But I was also reflecting on, and I think it's important for us to note that there are also some real countervailing pressures that are pushing against some of this, and to think a bit about how we manage those. Others have mentioned them, so I'm not going to get into that in too much detail. But just finally, I was reflecting on this question about what's different around challenging contexts. Are there particular issues that we need to be grappling with in thinking about environments which are more contested, conflictual, whether that's in terms of sort of hard conflict or otherwise other forms of instability? And it seems to me there are three areas that perhaps we need to do a bit more thinking on, and where I think we're starting to get our head around at ODI, but would welcome linking up perhaps with all of you as we think some of this through. The first is, I think it's clear that being more adaptive, more flexible in fragile environments which are more fluid makes a lot of sense. But I think we do need to get sort of better, or we need to do better than just calling on donors to be more flexible in fragile contexts, right? And it seems to me that part of what we could do better at is linking up the calls for more adaptive learning approaches to some of the theory again around policy reform, around political change, and how that happens. And I guess I want to just flag here colleagues of mine, David Booth, who chaired the last session, and Tim Kelsall, who I think is over there, are developing up some ideas at the moment, looking at how our understanding of different types of political settlements, including those which are more unstable, can, if you like, start to inform the range of options within which you can be adaptive. So understanding better the type of environment that you're working in can start to give you the sort of scope within which you can be flexible. And I think Tim touched on this a little bit in terms of his spaces for change ideas as well. It seems to me that in general there could also just be much better anticipation, if you like, of the sorts of reform and counter-reform rhythms that punctuate policy change processes. In a way, there's a lot of uncertainty, but we know there's often this constant process of, a few steps forward in the reform process and a few back. What that means to me is that we need to continue to move away from the focus of achieving, say, a given outcome in a particular time frame, to thinking much more about the processes of coalitions that are built around reformers which continue, beyond a given project or a given outcome being achieved, and what do those processes look like. Second point is about, I think, connecting up some of the discussion that we've been having here today with some of the wider evidence around what we're learning about building capacity around state building in more fragile environments. And there were some calls for us to reflect on some of this earlier today as well. We know there are multiple ways in which state institutions can develop and legitimacy can be built. But I think it's obvious that in terms of external actors, a very prominent focus, particularly in fragile states, has been around, providing things like public services as a key building block to legitimacy and state building. That sort of output-based legitimacy approach. And I've seen that reflected in a number of fragile states that I've worked in, including in South Sudan. But I think recent evidence is now being, much more widely shared, including from a research consortium housed at ODI called the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium, that's really failing to find, if you like, a clear causality between delivering things like services and those benefits around better legitimacy. But what that research does point to is that what can matter is how services are delivered, which again to me reinforces the fact that we need to be thinking much more around the how, around the processes, around things like ideas, norms, expectations, and how external actors navigate those, rather than just providing things. And my final point is just that I think a number of times we've been emphasising that reforms are led domestically, not externally. And it's one of the core principles of the Doing Development Differently manifesto. But that group has been criticised for still being perceived to be a fairly donor-driven agenda. And I think there's a real question for all of us as to how we get beyond this. And it seems to me that if we're talking about fragile states and very challenging environments where things are contested, there is a real question around who is locally leading a reform effort and the choices that get made by external actors as to who to support and who not. And how do we widen that up? Because fundamentally, I think we're all agreed this is about facilitating people at multiple levels to solve problems for themselves. So we need to be very careful around what our entry points are.
Very much. What I want to do, because it's 5 o'clock, there's half an hour to go, but to make the most effective use of half an hour, just turn to the person next to you and agree on the question you want to ask to the panel. I'll give you 3 minutes just to talk amongst yourselves. What's the key burning question you want the panel to address? So you've got 3 minutes just to talk to your neighbour. The microphone comment. Simon has to be quiet, apart from me. Right. Okay, we're going to go with Hamza first. Is it Hamza? Yeah.
Hello, Hamza, G7 Plus Secretariat. Just wanted to do a quick intervention regarding the comment of Mr. Pierce from USAID. I think it's very, we have to be very wary when we say that we choose not to differentiate the different contexts because development itself is challenging. For this very reason, ignoring the fact that there cannot be peace without development, there cannot be development without peace. That's the very reason why fragile and conflict-affected states were marginalized from the MDGs in the first place. This is why we had to organize ourselves. If we chose not to differentiate this and had a one-size-fits-all, today we wouldn't be talking about the Sustainable Development 16, we wouldn't have the New Deal. Earlier on we spoke about motivation. Necessity is the mother of all motivations. So it's, and also a second link to that, you know, it's also very good to talk about having this sort of introspective view of how we can change internally. But if we do it with a one-size-fits-all, then what are our reference points to those introspective changes?
Okay, thanks, Hamza. There was another, I think, hand up. Just, yes, thank you.
Thank you. Ian Quick, I'm a consultant here in London. My question's about expectations. Context sensitivity, being demand-driven, these are a bit like sunshine or a mother's love. These are things we all want. No one's going to say they disagree with them. It's when you get to the level of outcomes that you have to shoot a hostage. Someone doesn't get what they want. You accept that you don't do police reform or gender in parliament or something of this nature. So the question is, are we, in focusing on these process aspects, are we abdicating the responsibility to push back on what is often a quite irresponsible raising of expectations? Do we need to push for tighter language in national development strategies, in country assistance strategies, and less hand-waving, for lack of a better word, as to what's achievable? Because the bottom line on all of the process stuff is expectations do have to be scaled back, and often are not. What do we do in this regard? What is our responsibility as professionals or as administrators or as think tank folks?
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else? Rebecca, I think, just there.
Rebecca Simpson from LSE. So thanks for a really interesting set of comments. So my question is not to suggest that there wasn't a lot of sort of tangible advice in these presentations, but I would just like to challenge the entire panel to sort of give us one, if you could give one really concrete, practical suggestion of what a donor agency should change about their practices, what would it be? Different recruitment, kill the log frame, whatever it might be.
Okay, just before we come in, Charlie Goldsmith, just on that, we missed some of this session, but I know you had a burning question, and maybe it might touch on Rebecca's point about what can donors do, because Charlie, you're particularly interested in the use of technology. Did you want to say 1 minute on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, my work has been supporting what Emma described this morning on the implementation end of the spectrum. So in South Sudan, the systems that have underpinned capitation grants and cash transfers to schools and individuals, and the HR system in health doing the same sort of thing, supporting the reforms in health. I suppose my point really is about that threefold distinction between strategy, design, and operationalization. And I think there's actually quite a lot that comes out here that we know quite a lot about strategy, and Tim's report gives us a lot to go on about strategy and the kind of higher end of design. The question is how we capture and share the good stuff at sort of operational design and operationalization craft. And that's clearly something that the sector as a whole isn't particularly good at describing, maybe in the ways that a commercial management consultancy task would be described. It's also something that the further donors get away from having staff in fragile states, for a long period, it's something they know less about than in the eras when donor advisors came up as children at Makerere University learning their craft. You know, it's a new world where they won't have worked as coders, they won't have worked as implementers, and the question is, how do we join that up so they know what they're buying, and how do we as a sector that delivers this stuff set out that this is good stuff that works, and this is the difference between stuff that works and stuff that doesn't.
Okay, thank you. And we'll just take a couple more comments, then we'll come back to the panel. You're on notice that you've got to give, particularly Rebecca's point. Yeah, okay. The lady here in the front row.
Thank you. I'm Ulla Bago. I'm an ex-Danida person and now an independent consultant. I was just wondering, from your perspective, how does the Paris Declaration all fit in there? As one of them, because that's already a formal sort of a agreement between all the key stakeholders in our business. Second is human rights. Most donor agencies nowadays have human rights and poverty reduction as their main objective. So that's putting focus on individuals and well-being of individuals. So that could also be driving what you're doing there. Yes, and that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And the lady, Myra, this lady here, we'll give Shimi and then we'll come to you. Is that okay?
Okay. My name is Fushimi. I'm from the Japan International Cooperation Agency. I have one question. I think the Marcus raised as a challenge, the relationship between the log frame and the PDIA approach. Well, in order to get the finance and budget, I think we, not only BSI, but the World Bank and USAID and JICA is using log frame, which contradicts the philosophy of PDIA. So my question is how BSI is the managing or handling these issues.
Okay, great. Actually, we'll get to, sorry, we'll come at, Kathy's waving at me. So Kathy, you go.
We found the last presentation very interesting, and I think some of the things that Marcus was saying about finding the sweet spot between insiders and outsiders and the kind of breaking down the divide between project preparation and implementation really resonates with what we're trying to do in Nigeria. But it's always really frustrating for me to hear about the interesting things that USAID are trying on the skills side. I know the experience of the DFID team who are working on the better delivery, but there seems to be very little exchange between all the official aid agencies, whether they be multilateral or bilateral, for doing this in a much more systematic, well thought through, kind of comprehensive way and learning from each other as we go. So my question to the panel is, does ODI and people like Marcus's outfit have a role to play in that? Because I can see lots of tinkering around the edges. Actually, DFID's program, we shouldn't call that tinkering around the edges. But I think there's potentially quite a valuable role for ODI and others to play in helping us to do this in a much more evidence-based way that also shares these experiments amongst the institutions. Thank you.
No, you're right. You were just telling me that I should be looking at the screen.
I mean, if you're giving me the...
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Actually, what I raised with my colleagues here is the point that the Sustainable Development Goals are just around the corner now, and perhaps the number 17 goal is actually about multi-stakeholder partnerships, and an invisible but very powerful actor is the elephant in the room, is the role of the private sector, and involving them and doing things differently perhaps is a way of engaging with the private sector in a different way and seeing them as a solution and not as a problem.
Okay, thank you. I'll just go to Alistair and then we'll maybe take comments from the panel and we will come to that group in a minute.
Alistair McKechnie, ODI. I've got a couple of observations and questions. The first one is we've heard very little today about the role of people, the citizens of the country in this process, because what we've heard about is largely some kinds of negotiations between elites and donors. So what does the panel say about engaging with citizens, and not just the usual suspects who get invited to all these consultations who may have turned this into a living? The second question I have is really about the nature of the politics in the countries we're talking about, these difficult challenging contexts, and the donor politics themselves, because in these challenging contexts there's always this underlying threat of violence and chaos, and we've seen what happened in Syria, we've seen what happened in South Sudan, and the human and development cost of that is enormous, and sometimes the politicians in the country trying to hold all this together through allocating rents, corruption, and sort of buying loyalty, which is completely anathema to the sort of average donor development ministry. And then on the donor side, this approach we're talking about seems to me to be fundamentally incompatible with the results agenda, value for money, log frames, and all these other things, at least in the short term. Long term, you may get better results, but then the average life of a minister tends, in a industrialized country, tends to be 2 or 3 years in any case. So my question is how to manage this sort of clash of politics between the donor countries and the governments in challenging contexts.
Great. Okay, then we'll just pause there. We will come to the final third. I think I'm going to go Marcus, then Kathy, Lenny, then Steve. Marcus.
All right, well, perhaps if I could pick up a couple of those points. Shimi, your question about how BSI has escaped from the tyranny of the log frame, through a rather sort of clever little sleight of hand, whereby instead of having a log frame that promises that they will deliver specific outputs or specific outcomes, what they've in fact undertaken to do in their log frame is to achieve a certain number of significant institutional changes, the content of which are yet to be determined. And in a sense, they report against how many sort of breakthroughs they have had. And that reporting is done first and foremost as an internal process through detailed narrative reporting from the implementation team itself. But then the external evaluation is sort of written into the log frame so that the external evaluator, us, has to come along and validate that we agree that it's a significant institutional change. Now, I think this is more like a workaround than a solution, if you like. It's full of odd little problems, like how do you count institutional changes, seeing as they all sort of mix together in very complicated ways. But it does provide that sort of immediate flexibility for them to bring the sort of PDIA model to bear. I think there's an interesting point, which is that as you liberate programs from having to sort of report very precisely against their outputs, the quid pro quo, I think, has to be thinking about the governance of programs in more sophisticated ways. So there's a real question about sort of who gives these programs permission to be mucking around in, complicated political terrain, and who oversees them and how that's done. And I think that's the sort of the next. As you sort of weaken the grip of the log frame, that's where you have to strengthen in a compensatory way to have really good, strong governance arrangements to make sure that these things don't go awry. And then very quickly on the Paris Declaration point, I think that's really interesting because I think we've been, the Paris Declaration gave us this concept of ownership and alignment, but in a very, very kind of superficial way, in that we were sort of we came to understand that it was a precondition for a successful program that the country ownership and leadership had to be there, and this got interpreted in this sort of highly superficial way. In that if there's some language somewhere in a 200-page national development plan that you can hook your program onto, then you're aligned and that box is ticked. That's obviously not meaningful. What I think we heard quite clearly from the success stories that we heard this morning is that ownership and leadership is something that is constructed over time, over the course of a successful program. But what you have is these programs working on problems that have a genuine political salience, where there's a genuine interest on the part of a range of domestic counterparts to address. But the solutions are quite flexible and emerge over time, and the consensus around the specific solution is built over time. I think it's interesting, in some of Tim's learning that perhaps didn't come through today quite so clearly, was this point that a strategy, a reform strategy, is sort of never a sort of blueprint for what you do so much as a document that gives you the authorization to work on a certain set of issues. So it's almost more about permission than it is about alignment.
Sorry, I meant Verena, not Kathy. Verena, you probably thought you were let off the hook there, but no. Do you want to comment on any of those questions, comments that have been made from the floor?
Thank you, Simon. So I really wanted to, I think, respond on Rebecca's challenge to give a practical suggestion. And I think, have 4. So one is, don't be shy about addressing the issue of overheads. The cost of doing things differently is higher than doing things normally. So we've seen that in the case of the Nigeria program, and we see that with regards to South Sudan. And BSI, is basically a way of putting more boots on the ground. And we need that for these types of programs. But it goes against this push that aid should not have high overheads, that is a bad thing in itself. Mm-hmm. So that's one issue that sort of headquarters and at the political aid level needs to perhaps get back into, and it's a very difficult one. And of course, overheads shouldn't increase for silly stuff. So there must also then be a commitment to use staff time in more meaningful ways. The second point is, do deliberate experiments. So we can only learn in convincing ways if the organizations are willing to do deliberate experiments with tweaking or more deviation from business models. So we could say, so if we engage in 3 countries with higher overheads, do we get better results than we would likely get otherwise? Or if we use pooled funds, do we get better results than if we take a very focused approach? So we need to do more deliberate experiments than we also monitor and report back on. Third point, in general, I think it'd be good to do more pooled streams of funding, say for public financial management in a difficult environment. I spend a lot of my time dealing with little bits of funding and doing all the administrative work around that. And if we had a 50 million pot that lasts for X number of years, things would be easier. You reduce the time that's just spent on internal administration. And then the fourth is, find ways of revisiting and adjusting programs periodically. And I think that goes with what Marcus say. If you reduce the sort of strength of the log frame up front, you must have a really meaningful way to revisit without, again, making that overly bureaucratic, but really getting into the nitty-gritty and the sort of discussion of where are we, why are we here, and what is the most sensible thing to do next.
And you've given 4 examples, so we'll let Marcus off the hook that he didn't give one example. But Lenny and Steve are still on the hook for one specific change. Lenny, do you want to...
Okay. Maybe I'll just work back from a few of the comments. Alistair raised a number of points around engaging with citizens and some of the kind of political discourse, which I think are key. And actually, I have for some time now been quite interested in following some of the debates here in the UK and some of the politics and the public attitude around aid and development. And at ODI we did a few years back now, but we did some research looking at public attitudes of citizens around the country towards aid and development. And I've been following a lot of the opinion polling and kind of perception monitoring that's happening, including through a large Gates-funded program at the moment called the Narrative Project as well. And I think what's actually interesting coming out of that is that there's quite a consistent sense that actually citizens in the UK are a bit fed up of a fairly simplistic aid story that's told to them that they don't really believe. They don't really believe it's as easy as we give money overseas and great things will happen. And there is, I think, potentially more openness or more space to be having, if you like, a more honest or realistic conversation about some of the challenges and trade-offs of investing and supporting reform overseas, but also why we do it. So I think actually the opinion data backs up the fact that we should be changing the nature of that conversation and investing more in it, which I think is very much in line with your point. And I think it links to me, and I think a bit to some of the comments that Steve was making about how to frame this within USAID, that I don't think we can say this is something that is at odds with a results agenda. You know, it has to be about taking results more seriously, not less seriously, but it's about having an open discussion about what it really takes to get results and how we set a reasonable benchmark for what those results are. And I think, again, it seems to me there is a space where politicians are invested because they want to be achieving things in that we can actually capitalize on rather than shy away from. But I know there's a very live debate about that at the moment. A few other quick thoughts. I thought it was interesting to hear some of the reflections around the SDGs and the fact that we need to widen up the conversation to other actors in development. And I think that's true. And in fact, some of the ideas we've been discussing today in terms of being more entrepreneurial, more agile, there's a whole debate around how you do that within the private sector. Some interesting examples, but I think also some very poor examples where practice is not as adaptive and flexible as it claims to be. So a key aim actually for some of our work around this agenda is to widen up the conversation, to be going out and talking to actors within the private sector, but also in other parts of public policy, here in the UK, in the US, having very similar conversations around how you get reforms to healthcare, to education, which are really paralleling some of the debates around what we know it takes in other countries. So we're actively trying to widen up. I guess I should come back to Rebecca's request. Okay, well, my very practical suggestion, it seems to me that one easy thing to do would be to actually reduce down the staff turnover in posts if we're actually incentivising contextual knowledge. I think some of the DFID reforms actually are trying to do some of that by ensuring that you maintain a level of accountability even after you've moved on. It seems to me you could go one step further. And I think there's also a lot out there on how to do adaptive programme management that we could take off the shelf and adapt to development practice as well. Maybe just finally, Kathy, thank you for your suggestion that at ODI we should be convening exchange between agencies. I think it's something we should talk about offline, and if others in this room would like to discuss more, I think we're very keen to think about how we can support the sharing of lessons across different agencies, and it seems to me there is a gap there that you've identified.
I thought that's what we were doing now.
We can continue. We continue the conversation.
Steve.
So the first thing I want to do is avoid the headline that the U.S. advocates one size fits all. That's clearly not what I had in mind when I made that comment. In fact, it was quite the other way. It's that as we think about how to prepare our Foreign Service officers, we're preparing all of them to work in challenging environments. Some people call them non-permissive environments, whatever. And so we have changed the way that we prepare our Foreign Services officer. I clearly have to spend more time with Kathy because I sort of resent I'm pushing back against the tinkering remark. And I will be in Nigeria in November, and so I'm going to look into why there's tinkering there and not wholesale change. But let me just say that over the past 5 years, we've doubled our Foreign Service staff, which means that we have gotten permission from our political masters to make massive reforms. And one of the ways we did this, to address one of the other questions, is our administrator in 2011 went up to the Hill, up to Congress, 147 times. I think that's remarkable that the head of an agency would spend that much time with Congress, Parliament, or what have you. But that's the only way to get that political space. I want to spend just a second on this one thing, and I think it's one of the things that we found out today is there is not one thing. All of these things are sort of interconnected, but for us they start with one very clear concept, and that is development is a discipline. I think you called it a craft earlier on, but we look at development in the exact same way that we look at any other professional discipline. It requires a set of knowledge and skills that allows one to effectively manage and operate within that environment. And I, as the former U.S. DAC delegate and having conducted several peer reviews. It scares me when my counterparts feel that somebody in a diplomatic post in a ministry is just as capable of working in a conflict-affected state. And you know, the sort of interchangeability of somebody who may be the public affairs spokesperson in the Ukraine and then, you know, in a year is in Afghanistan. We have had to make some of our critical priority countries one-year postings in order to get the number of people that we need. But what's amazing to me is what we've seen over the past 3 years is the number of people requesting extensions. And so it is much easier for us to maintain continuity than it was, you know, say 5 years ago. But this one realization that development is a discipline, and looking at what are the knowledge and skill areas and aptitudes, not just language skills, but really how do you do certain things in different contexts, is I guess for me the one big thing. And just lastly I feel compelled to address the Paris Declaration question. I was the special coordinator for development effectiveness for the U.S. for 4 years. And I would encourage you to go beyond Paris to Busan. I think that there's a qualitative difference, I think, in the Busan Partnership Agreement from the Paris Declaration. And in part, it gets to what has already been said about the aid effectiveness agenda and really drilling down into what that means, and that it's not now just an agreement among elites, but involves this much broader range of stakeholders. I'd love to talk about local systems some more, but I'll save that for another time.
Right, it's got quite a few comments. So we'll go this, Mara, if we go, we'll work this way to the gentleman at the end, and then we'll work backwards across. Yeah, we're running out of time, so sorry, we're going to push you for time. But
yeah, my name's Adam Feinberg. I work in the international space. I also do a lot of work in the domestic space in the UK and public services, and there's been quite a revolution in the last 5-10 years in terms of reflective practice and business. It would have been in the 360 degree. In teaching, it's reflective practitioner. But in public services, it's been about the end user experience. So in the case of development, it's a donor beneficiary relationship. And in case of services, it's the provider-beneficiary relationship. And there's something that's happened quite significantly in the UK by using things like customer insight, tracking customer journey, and leaders or providers of services, hearing those direct from those experiences and the problems that have been put in place, the constraints by the providers, the donors in this case maybe, for the recipients in creating a functioning system that works for people and designing services and reviewing and redesigning services based on experience. So we're talking here, the title of the session is about reform, installing reform, almost sort of make an edict, but maybe there's something also, and we know there's very good reasons why aid doesn't work, outcomes are not realised, there's duplication, lack of coordination, so on. It's because people are doing different things. But if there was a requirement, if there was that transformation, which there has been in the UK space, that we look at the outcome from the end user perspective, and that's where we start to design or redesign services, we wouldn't have to coordinate amongst agencies or collaborate or develop joint learning. We'd be starting from that very same starting point, and would it all be responsible? There'd be collaborative degree of responsibility to ensure that we're meeting the client needs based on their experience.
Okay, great. Just let's move quickly across. The lady at the back, and then we'll come to Keston and then back to the front.
Ines Freire from the University of East Anglia. And my question is related with the trade-off between short-term and long-term. So when we think of challenges that can be tackled by humanitarian assistance, then maybe change will be seen very quickly. But then if we talk about reforms that require behavioral change or institutional change, maybe we need to be more patient in observing the change or the impact of assistance. So my question is just how to prioritize or to see the differences.
Okay, thank you. And then to Keston and then...
Hi, I'm going to be very quick. Thank you again for all the presentations. I think a fundamentally unresolved issue and that we have not dealt with is what is development? And the reason I ask that is because conceptually, there's an assumption that we're all on the same level in terms of our understanding of what that is. And we risk sort of emphasizing all these reforms and institutional reforms as a synonym of development, as opposed to understanding what is the outcome and what is the end point that we are trying to achieve. And perhaps, I'm sorry for this coming at the very end, but I think that's something, I mean, there's a lot of new work as well, pointed out David Booth, and you pointed it out as well, by Mushtaq Khan. He does not only focus on political stability, which is, I think, is what has been focused on here, but on issues of technological capability, as well as issues of primitive accumulation. And some of those many of the reform efforts that have been done by USAID, by World Bank, and so on, are directed at the private sector. But we haven't actually discussed the private sector and how the reforms that are directed through PPPs and so on are affecting these kinds of arrangements. So,
okay, good. Thank you. I think there's lots of questions that will have to be discussed over a glass of wine. But finally,
Hi, Sasha Kishan-Chan with ITAD. My question pertains to freeing ourselves from the tyranny of the log frame and recognizing that we need accountability. From my experience anyway, and perhaps you can clarify for me, the difference between accountability in terms of auditing and accountability in terms of impact analysis, which is how I think a log frame should be used and is different from auditing, but I think often it's blurred.
Okay, and I think I'm just going to take one final point just from actually online, actually. A lady called Margarita Aswani says, I work for the DFID-funded State Partnership for Accountability, Responsiveness and Capability, that's SPARC, for those of you, program in Nigeria. As mentioned above, with the exception of Kathy Bain's presentation referring to Edo State and Nigeria, not very much has been said about driving change at the subnational level. If any of your panelists could address the federal-state links, it would be appreciated. Thank you. I think the answer, actually, Margarita, if you're still online, is that there's quite a lot of information that actually BSI has operating at the subnational level, and we can perhaps get back to you on that. So we have got some information, so that's the answer to that question. But Kathy, just so you know, someone in Nigeria was listening to you. Now, I think we're running out of time, so just one final quick remark from the panel, and then I've just got some comments to sum up. So, Steve, we'll start with you, and we'll go that way, and Verena will give you the last word.
There's not really a thread that runs through these 4 questions, I'm just going to pick one, and it's the last one actually, and that's the local level. Within our new country development strategy, we require a local systems approach. And the local system refers to the interconnected set of actors that include governments, includes civil society, includes the private sector, universities, anybody else who could possibly be perceived as a stakeholder. There's a lot of tools to do stakeholder analysis. We don't advocate a particular one, just that it be done. Some people call it political economy analysis, some people call it other things, but I do think it's important that when we're trying to achieve results at the local level, that's where we need to begin, and that's where our reforms are targeting right now.
Great. Okay, Lenny.
Well, I guess just finally, I think it was great to hear some of the reflections from the UK reform experiences, and I think I am seeing now a kind of increasing interest in kind of user-centered design approaches within development. WDR 2015 talked about behavioural insights and brought in some of those aspects around psychology of users and providers. So I think there is a lot that I think we're learning collectively. I don't think we have the answers in the UK, because I think there's still been a lot of challenges in terms of how to put that into practice and how much it's really shaped big systems, led to big system-wide reform. But it seems to me an ongoing sharing of practices from around the world makes a lot of sense.
Great. Marcus, anything?
Well, I also wanted to pick up on that sort of end-user donor-beneficiary sort of interaction thing. It's been a huge theme for ICAI over the years to push DFID to have more structured interaction with beneficiaries and to get that sort of feedback running consistently right the way through the program cycle. DFID is certainly responding to that, but I think there's an awful lot of learning that has to be going on about how to do that well and take it beyond the sort of the token to the meaningful. And I think Andrew's sort of three-model theory that he offered us early on about the embeddedness having to occur down to the citizen level, I think gives us potentially a very interesting way of thinking about that problem in a more structured way, about how donor interventions can help to translate sort of citizen demands, citizen complaints, citizen aspirations for a better life into meaningful demand for policymakers and technicians. And then as we start to identify solutions, how to then make those part of the public's expectations so that that helps to lock in the technicians and the politicians. So I think there's a lot of work that can usefully be done around that.
Great. Verena, final point. I think you're on mute, I think. We can't hear you. You're still on mute, I think. Sorry.
We're not.
Oh, you are now. You're okay. Go.
Can you hear us?
Yes, yes.
All right. So just to come back to one of the priors that I had in the presentation earlier, ultimately it's domestic actors that do change. We can only sort of enable, refine, support. So that I think is something that we have to really absorb within our institutions more and draw the implications of how then we best leverage what we do. Then the second thought is, it's not really so much the tyranny of the log frame that is the problem. Speaking from the sort of, operational trenches, it's the tyranny of the bureaucracy. It's the amount of time that gets wasted on internal management and on bureaucracy. That is really what I think is most of a hindrance to a more problem-driven iterative adaptation or any kind of step-by-step process. It's in part driven because of all these pains of trying to control the agent. But that is something that really, between the different development partners, we need a bigger dialogue of how can we get beyond that to support change in difficult environments. And we have plenty of very difficult environments that we need to address when we look at all the refugee crisis and beyond.
Okay, thanks very much. I've just got a few things just to say to sum up. The day was called Driving Change in Challenging Contexts. My summary is 11 C's. Change is possible. That's one of the themes that's come out today. Context is important. Collaboration has been that point made by many of the speakers, between donor agencies, between different actors, whether we're talking about coalitions, committees, CLA, I can't remember what CLA meant now, but it was, there you go, collaborative learning. Complementary actions are needed. BSI, my mouth was salivating when they talked about, Marcus made the point about spending £3 billion pounds of DFID money in fragile states. No, BSI couldn't do that, but the evidence is actually flexible actors can help leverage spend in many places. There's been a very interesting collaboration between BSI working in South Sudan, leveraging in or helping the World Bank in a number of projects there, helping the EU spend larger sums of money. I think flexible actors can actually work in a complementary way to other actors and get the best of both. Change actors, I was in Kinshasa last week talking to our team there. Change actors must embody the change that they're trying to demonstrate. We talked a lot about dot joiners. The BSI team in Kinshasa, if they want to encourage their government counterparts to join the dots, they themselves need to join the dots. They must embody the change they're trying to demonstrate. Coordination, I liked, Verena, your point, a coordination quagmire, but coordination is really important. Compliance, it's not just about new laws, it's about compliance. There's an issue about culture. The BSI team are going to stay in London for the next 2 days. We're going to have a day looking at our cultural compass and engaging cross-culturally. And my final C is crisis, let's not waste it. And if we haven't got one, maybe we need to create one. But anyway, that's the best I can do in terms of a summary. I just wanted to say a couple of thank yous. Thanks to our technicians at the back. The technology's worked fantastically, and there's been a team of people behind the scenes in ODI and in the World Bank making that work. Julia's our comms officer, another C, has done a fantastic job in terms of making all this live and to help prepare for it. And there's also been a team of people in ODI, Myra and others, who've been actually behind the scenes making this work. And the catering staff have been brilliant. Thank you to the chairs. Thank you to the panelists. We better give these people a quick clap for their contributions. And also, most importantly, I feel these events, we never often give enough time to you, the audience, because the combined array of talent out there is fantastic. One of the nice things actually of chairing an event in ODI is actually you see the fantastic talent out there. I'm sorry we haven't probably done justice to all your questions, but maybe you can just, over a glass of wine, pin the speaker or the panelist who you think's got the answer. The other thing just to say is that we will get information out. We'll try and find a way to share the presentations and get stuff out. Finally, before I offer you a glass of wine, we want to launch this, but I just wanted to ask Marcus Manuel to come and just say a few words, just to formally launch this. Marcus was the visionary behind the setting up of BSI 5 years ago, so I'd like to give him the last word, both to introduce this as well.
Marcus, Cox and I have always been embarrassed about the idea of sharing a panel, because when you address the question to Marcus, we're going to get very confused. I also want to thank Marcus, Simon, those kind words about being visionary. I think the other point was, yes, I was the person who came up with the sleight of hand that allowed us to manoeuvre our way through log frames. I'm not sure. There's nothing else I want to take credit to. I think there's a lot to be really encouraged about today, and just about the progress, and about the money that has got out to some very, very poor people in South Sudan, because that was Moses's problem. So Moses, who wasn't here, the subnational grant was his problem, and BSI was created completely oblivious to the fact that that was the biggest problem we were going to end up solving. The money has continued to go, even when the government was so cash-strapped, they were fighting, I assumed it would be cut because they couldn't maintain it. They maintained it, they kept these grants going, despite all the fiscal pressures, despite the low oil price, despite the war that was going on. And that reflects the fact that when you work on a problem which domestic actors really do own and really do care about and who have built the coalition, these things stick. And that's the tribute. So this idea of working with problems, I think, is really important. I think we should be encouraged to do that. I have, however, two challenges. I think we're being lazy in two ways. We're being lazy in not thinking hard enough about what we need to do to make this work. And in particular, we need to be long-term. The person in South Sudan, in our team, the longest person working in South Sudan, has 40 years' experience of working in that country at the highest level, starting with former presidents. Most of the team have had 7 years' experience. And also, we do it without the money. Power corrupts, money corrupts even more. As soon as you come with money to the table, you're in problems. And you have to worry about safeguards, you have to worry about disbursement pressures, and both those are deeply, deeply inimical into trying to support change. If we believe those things to be true, then we also need to turn our political lens to the donors. And we're being lazy, and this is the second reason we're lazy, and we're lazy about not thinking and helping the donors to know themselves. I and any others here have spent 30 or 40 years hammering out the same point. You can't buy reform, you can only support it. Ownership is really important. Adaptive programs, loans are a really good idea. Having more people there for a longer time, I have been saying that, and others have been saying this for about 30 years. There's come some point which we ought to collectively say, well, there is no point in saying this yet again. What we need to do is apply all the thoughts we just had collectively about our political intentions to how we do with donor reform. And if you want a solution, I think one of the solutions is to be honest and to say 1% of donor spend cannot be managed through log frames. One size does not fill all. What worked for US military defense, what worked to make sure we build roads relatively well, does not work well for measuring how we do reform. So let's not it be that Simon or Kathy have to be clever about how they manage the log frames. Let's just admit we need a different way of doing it. Let us give the space to say, well, how do we start in a way that really will allow us to go in, recognizing in all humility that no matter how much design we do, we won't know the problems until we really start talking to people and they start talking to us. It took Moses at least a year to realize that was his real problem. Okay? So it takes time. We need to be given time. We need to allow our domestic partners who we need to do it time. We have not, really not got the tools. It's not the tyranny of the log frame. It is really deeply, fundamentally wrong, and we've got to find a different way. And we've got to accept we're not trying to change all 13 billion of expenditure, but some of it does need to change. That's what I'll be pushing for taking out of this, because I've been encouraged that what we're doing here is right and it's good, but actually it's really, really difficult to do. But for the sake of Moses and for the sake of the poorer people in South Sudan, who otherwise would not get the money without this program, we need to keep fighting for them. That's what I want to do, and so look forward to joining you over a glass of wine to take it forward. But I mean, it's been a great session and great to see so many people here. Thank you.
Thank you. So, thank you very much again, and I hope if everything works like clockwork, there may be a glass of wine out the front that you can have on your way home. Thank you very much.